Good afternoon, class. Today we're going to go over Chapter 9, the elderly and the criminal justice system. And we're going to talk about some generational issues first. And then we're going to discuss how generations become elderly and what that term means and how elderly are treated and some statistics about elderly within the criminal justice system. So as we go through this, think of your parents if they're elderly, if you think they're elderly, or your grandparents. And again, we'll do some comparisons about the elderly with others that are involved in the criminal justice system. Here we go. Question for you. What is the current life expectancy in the United States? How many years? What's the average current life expectancy of people that live in the United States? What do you think it is? Per the book, it's 78 years old. Is that old? Is that young? We'll have a discussion about that. The book does a good job talking about the different types, the different generations. Talks about the baby boomers, about after World War II, the explosion of births that occurred. And they said this is the book talking, not personal experience, but the book talks about narcissism and individual pleasure. So there's some of the baby boomer folks right there. Can you recognize anybody, or are these folks too old for you to recognize? You may know that guy right there. Maybe you might know her right there. Maybe you know that guy right there. So, baby boomers. Next, the book talks about the Generation X, born between 1965 and 1979. Often ignored, misunderstood, basically a disheartened generation. Generally, per the book, lack of optimism for the future and absence of trust. The term slackers comes into play with some of these folks. Okay, so these are not the elderly yet. Generation Y, is this any of you? And this is the generation that makes up about 20% of the population. They're very, very racially and ethnically diverse, better relationships with parents, somewhat independence, and they're very technologically inclined. Now, when we get to elderly Americans, these folks, Generation Z, could be you. Again, they're going to be elderly a lot further down the line than other people. Very less traditional family backgrounds, more likely to have friends from different ethnic, religious, and racial groups, use their phones more than television, and have better relationships with parents, but often not leaving home until later. So through these generations, they're very different from each other. So when we talk about elderly, and again, think of that 78 years old, the victims tend to have lower levels of physical victimization by criminals. So elderly victims are not usually killed or robbed or raped. They're only having their possessions taken from them. Some of the victims tend to have lower victimization rates, and again, tend to be property crime victims. Eldercide as a crime, that's a murder of a person age 65 or older. That is rare. Elderly abuse, which we're going to talk about later, is very prevalent. And when we talk about elderly abuse, we're going to talk about that more so on a different day. But for right now, just some basic information about elderly abuse. The exact figure of abuse is not known. There's no uniform reporting system about it. And most of the time, it is not reported. Those are some estimates. And again, mistreatment or abuse, usually it's somebody that they depend on for care. And it can be emotional, physical, monetary, it could be various types of abuse. So there's 5 cases for every 1 reported. So again, it goes largely unreported. And some of you out there who end up become teachers or law enforcement, courts or corrections, or other jobs that involve elderly folks or children will be mandated reporters, and you'll have to report any suspected abuse. And we'll have a separate slideshow on that coming up. So the types of abuse, there's financial, whether it's a con game or fraud. Someone calls up, says, "Hey, grandma, this is grandson so and so, and I'm in trouble. I need some help." That's a fraud or a con game that's played. Every once in a while, you see that. Physical abuse, older women are more likely than men to be abused. Usually, abusers are also likely to be women, often family members. So the abused are females mostly, and the abusers are often females, per the book. Does anybody know anybody that is elderly that's in a old folks home or a nursing home? Does abuse go on there? Have you heard of that? Who's the typical elderly offender when it comes to offenders? Do elderly people commit crimes? The stereotypical image of a confused or elderly person who shoplifts or harmless crime. We're going to talk more about that. So defining elderly is also challenging. Sometimes based on age category, other times it's based on an offense. Is elderly 60? Is it 65? Is it 62? Is it 78? Each state has a different category. What do you consider an elderly victim? Do they have to be a certain age? What do you consider a crime against an elderly person? Should the person that commits a crime against an elderly person, should they be held more liable and get more sentencing, more sanctions because they've committed a crime against an elderly person? Because elderly people are more vulnerable than others. So some research looks at an expectation that an elderly crime wave would occur. It did not, because of the amount of elderly people that were going to be in the United States in the 80s. Researchers said there's going to be a crime wave of elderly people committing crimes. That did not occur. So again, the research turned out to be incorrect. Types of offenders, usually it's shoplifting. And research shows the case is done not out of financial necessity or need for attention. So sometimes the folks that do this, they need food or attention. So again, if you have a 75-year-old person that's stealing meat from a supermarket, do you call the police and have them arrested? Or do they just need some food? Homicide. It's rare, but it does happen. What I have seen personally here in California is usually murder-suicide of a couple that's been married for 50 years. One has a inoperable brain tumor or cancer, and they make a pact, and one kills the other, then kills themselves. This just happened at a retirement home a couple weeks ago. And again, that's more common than a 65-year-old man killing someone else. But homicide is in the stats. More likely to use a weapon to commit the act, and usually it's in the privacy of a home when these homicides do occur. Sex offenses, popular image of Catholic priests preying on little boys, or the Sandusky case shapes our understanding of the problem. Sex offenders, in my experience, have usually been older Caucasian males that have molested usually grandchildren or children that they knew in the neighborhood, and it usually went on for years. And they were prolific sex offenders. And in the institution, in the prison, as well as on parole, these are very, very calculating offenders, because nobody thinks that Grandpa Jones would ever touch a child like that. But it happens more frequently than you think and is very underreported. And we'll talk more about this whole sex offender issue coming up. Usually it's intrafamilial, and that means within the family, as opposed to extrafamilial, which is outside of the family. So usually they know the family member, and is usually males. Some current issues. Lately, there's been a lot of driving while under the influence of medication, not necessarily alcohol or drugs, but medication that the older person is taking. They pass out at the wheel and they crash. Formal reactions to the elderly criminal. What are our reactions? What do we do with the elder? What do we do with a 65-year-old man that commits a robbery? Those folks are very challenging for the prison and jail system to accommodate them because they have special needs, whether it's diet, whether it's physical restrictions, whether it's mobility issues. So it's very expensive and very challenging. There's a prison in California called it's in Stockton, and it's an adult prison, and it holds usually geriatric prisoners. These are prisoners that are older, that have a lot of needs. So it's a whole prison designed for the older, aging prisoner. There's an early release program for people that are 60 years or older, depending on the crime, depending on how long they've served, to get out early. They probably like that, but just think of the victims. Do they have a say in that? Do you want Grandpa Jimmy to get out 20 years early when he was sentenced to life, 25 years to life for molesting several children, but now he's going to get out when he's 65 after serving 10 years? So there's some issues with the early release from prison. We have some questions here that you should answer, and you don't need to turn them in, but keep them for any upcoming exams or position papers or anything else that you may use it for. So just answer these questions, keep the information, you may use it again, and with that said, that's our chapter. If you have any questions, go ahead and place it on the discussion board, and if not, we will talk to you very soon. Thank you and have a great day.